Hey everybody, it's Tuesday, it's 3 o'clock. That means it's Tech Tuesday. I'm Rick Usey, and today I'm going to be talking about the Broadband Data Act, which is an act that was passed by Congress last year. And because of that, now the FCC has been working on some mandates for quite a while now that are going to be for broadband providers on reporting broadband data and mapping those kinds of things. So that's what we're talking about today, and I will be right back. So again, back here for Tech Tuesday, talking about the Broadband Data Act. So if you're online, feel free to say hello via chat. You can chat back and forth with each other, or just say hello, where you're from, that kind of thing. But this is really applicable to everybody out there who's a broadband operator. So this is important information. I'm going to try to distill some of it down for you because you're going to be hearing more about this as we go through this. So again, feel free to chat or ask any questions. I'll try to cover some of those at the end. And let's talk about what's going on here. So it's the Broadband Data Act, and that stands for the Broadband Deployment Accuracy and Technological Availability Act. So we know how telecom loves their acronyms, and this is no exception right here. So that's why the data is in capitals. And basically what this is, let's see if we can get everything working here. Yeah, okay. So this is also, in addition to, hold on, let me see, make sure everybody can hear what I'm doing here. She can hear and see me. That's good. Okay. So it could be that you guys weren't seeing anything locked up, and I was just sitting here looking stupid locked up myself, but everything on my screen locked up. So the FCC has now, as part of this, they put out their final report and order on this, on what's going to be required for broadband operators to be able to get this broadband mapping system up and running. So that's what we're talking about today. So let's talk a little bit about first where we've been, how we got here. So in 2000, you guys are probably familiar with this. So in 2000, the FCC started collecting information about broadband subscribers via Form F477 that the FCC had out there. And at first it was just collecting information on subscribers, but then in 2013 they revised that and started collecting information more about deployment data. Maximum speeds in a census block had to be reported, and the technology that was being used. And then you also needed to indicate whether that was residential or business subscribers. So, and nobody was very happy about that at the time, and still probably are not, that you have to provide that information. So some of this will, if not all of this, will take the place of the 477 form. I don't know if that's going to go away right away, but I'm assuming as this gets in place and everybody starts using this new system, that there's not going to be a need for that form. Now, one of the problems with the way this was reported is that the way this data was collected is that if there was one end user in a census block that was getting a service at a particular speed, then the FCC had that marked down as that area being served. So even if it was just one customer in a census block, that was considered served. So this is part of the reason for this, is to get away from that, or to improve that situation. There have been a lot of complaints over time about the accuracy of broadband deployment, and this is a way to get that more accurate. So then in August 2019, the FCC created the Digital Opportunity Data Collection thing. So this is where they're going to be collecting this granular broadband data from all ISPs in the form of coverage maps. And this is also going to include a process for challenging that. So ISPs will report the information, then anybody will be able to challenge that submitted data. And then in March 2020, Congress passed the Broadband Data Act, and that was basically ratifying what the FCC had laid out as what they wanted to do as far as this digital opportunity data collection that they were going to be doing. So that ratified that. But it barred the FCC from delegating any of that to USAC, which is the organization that manages the Universal Service Fund and that collects that money, and then that money can be used for purposes of broadband deployment. Originally it was used for providing telephone service in rural areas, but then later it was modified for rural broadband, as now, that's the most important thing. But this act was passed, but there was basically no money appropriated to make it happen. So then in December 2020, $1.2 trillion stimulus COVID bill that was passed. A lot of that was COVID relief. I think $900 billion was COVID relief. And then out of that 900 billion, hold on one second. That did not show. There we go. So 7 billion for broadband, and then 65 million of that broadband was for mapping purposes. So that's where this is covered. So now there is money to cover this, and the FCC is moving forward on this initiative and on these mandates to be able to do this. So this applies to everybody. If you look at the report and order, I don't see any real exclusions for anybody that's providing any kind of significant broadband service or service. So physical facilities that the entity owns and that terminate at the end user premises. So if you own the facilities and you're providing service to the end user, you're covered basically. But also that includes facilities that the entity has a right to use from another entity, such as dark fiber. So even if it's not your fiber, for example, you still are going to have to provide this information. Unbundled network elements, UNE loops, special access lines, or other lease facilities. Wireless spectrum is licensed, or that the entity manages or has obtained rights to use. So whether you've licensed that spectrum or you've obtained rights to use it, and even unlicensed spectrum. So if you are using traditional licensed spectrum, if you just recently got CBRS licensed spectrum, or even CBRS unlicensed spectrum, or any other unlicensed spectrum, you are a facilities-based provider as long as you're providing that service to the end user. So what do you need to report? For speeds that are below 25 by 3, now 25 by 3 is the minimum amount that the FCC defines as broadband. Anything less than that is not officially broadband per their definition. A lot of people wanted them to raise that higher to like 100 meg, maybe by 10 meg down, or 10 meg up, so 100 by 10. But they've kept the speed at 25.3, and they plan on keeping it that way for at least the next year, assuming nothing changes with the new administration. But so anything less than 25.3, there are two categories that you need to report. One is if it's 200 kilobits per second in at least one direction and less than 10 by 1. So that's not very fast, but you need to report in that category if that's what you're providing. Or if you're 10 by 1 at least, greater than or equal to 10 by 1, and less than 25 by 3, that's another category that you would report in. And then if you are meeting the 25 by 3, I'm assuming that's greater than or equal to 25 by 3 megabits per second, then you're going to report the maximum advertised download and upload speeds in an area. And it's interesting that it says advertised. I'm not sure how they're going to handle that, because you may advertise, let's say you're providing gig service, you may advertise we provide a gigabit service, gig down, but do people get a gig? You know, are they getting 900 megabits per second, which is pretty good, but are they getting everything? So again, this can be challenged. So I don't know how the FCC is going to handle advertising versus actual speeds, because it does say maximum advertised download and upload speeds. Maybe that'll be made more clear here coming up, and then what happens with challenges in that case. So we'll talk about a little bit more about challenges here in a minute. So again, what must be reported? So you have to indicate whether the service is available to business or residential customers. So if you're providing the service to just businesses in the area, you know, you have to indicate that, and that you're not providing it to residential customers. You have to report latency. So this is not quite as onerous as it sounds, because you don't have to report exactly what your latency is, but you have to meet a threshold and report whether or not you're meeting it. So whether the network round-trip latency associated with each maximum speed combination reported for a particular geographic area is less than or equal to 100 milliseconds, based on the 95th percentile of measurement. So most operators are going to meet this. Geostationary satellite operators are not going to meet this. There may be some others that may not for some reason or another, but most will meet this. Most of your cable operators, and certainly your fiber operators, 5G, has got very low latency, so that should not be an issue. So it's not like they're asking you to report, you know, do you have 10 milliseconds or 20 or whatever. They just want to know, are you less than or equal to 100 milliseconds in that particular area for the 95th percentile of the measurements that you take. And I don't think there's anything yet about whether you have to actually go through a testing process or not. You know, it may be that you have to test like you would, for example, if you take RDOF funds, you've got to test for latency. It's a little bit more strict on the types of latency that you have to have, because you've got to meet what you signed up for in the RDOF, and they've got a testing program that was laid out for CAF2, that it may be that this will be applying to that, and that you have to, again, do that testing and then verify that you're meeting that 100 milliseconds or less? I don't know yet. That's not been defined as far as I know. And by the way, this reporting has to be done twice a year, so that has been laid out. So twice a year you're going to have to make these reports. What can't be reported as coverage? This is pretty interesting. And some of this, it's like, well, you know, are people going to be able to meet this? So if the drop distance exceeds 500 feet, that's the way I read what I was looking at here. And by the way, there's a link below if you want to look at this report in order. If there's the third one basically linked down below. There are two others that were done prior to that. This last one was done after the funds were allocated for this. So if you want to check that out. But it mentioned if the drop distance exceeds 500 feet and then some other distance things that they talked about. For example, DSL service can't exceed 6,600 route feet from the DSLAM. And that would be if you have 25 by 3 service only or better. So if you've got less than 25 by 3, they don't care, I guess. So in that case, though, they want to make sure that it's 6,600 route feet from the DSLAM. And if it's not, if it's more than that, then supposedly you can't report that as an area being covered. But I'll explain there's some caveats to that. Fiber service runs can't exceed 196,000 route feet from the OLT to the ONT. That's pretty far. It's about 37 miles or so. And then HFC cable runs can't exceed 12,000 route feet from aggregation point to the prim. And this didn't seem very far to me. That's about 2.25, a little over 2.25 miles. And the aggregation point, I'm assuming, is the CMTS. So that, I guess it could be a node. Maybe that's a node. But in any event, if it's the CMTS, then I would have to be thinking that they're leaving the fiber portion of that out. So if you go all the way out to the fiber, to the node with fiber, then maybe they're talking about just the coax portion of the plant. Or maybe the fiber node is what they're terming as an aggregation point. It doesn't say CMTS. Where it says OLT and ONT, it doesn't say CMTS in the report and order, so I'm not sure exactly what they're talking about there. So one way or the other, they can't mean from the CMTS all the way out to the customer. Otherwise, they'd be requiring like a distributed access architecture right away. Maybe not necessarily right away, but you know, a lot of people are moving that way with they're doing DAA to get the CMTS out to the edge, and that will mitigate some of these requirements anyway because they'll be a lot closer to the customer. But I don't think they're talking about that. So it's either that the node is the aggregation point or the CMTS is the aggregation point, but they're not counting the fiber in that distance. Don't know for sure. But there are caveats. Like I say, there's exceptions to this maximum distances. So I have a feeling what they're doing is they're grandfathering people in wherever you're providing service now, however you're providing it. And then this would be more for moving forward, for like, let's say, greenfield opportunities where you're launching service in an area for the first time. So one of the exceptions is if you have a current subscriber at the location. So obviously, if you're already providing service, it sounds like they're grandfathering in that fact that you can count that area as one where you're providing that speed of service. If you previously had a subscriber using the same technology, so even if you don't have a subscriber there anymore, but you had one previously using the same technology. Now, you know, one thing that's interesting is this is really based on addresses. So unlike before where it was census blocks, and you were saying, you know, you're saying I can provide this speed of service in the census blocks. Now it's by address. So this may certainly mean that if you've got an address that you've never serviced in an area, then you can't count that as meeting that speed if you've got these kinds of distances involved. So it may be that you've got neighbors around that you've been providing the service, but you never were able to provide service to one particular house. It may be that you can't count that in this case. Unless you previously had a subscriber. So if you had a subscriber at that address at some time in the past using the same technology, then you can count it. So again, there's a lot of questions I had about this that I'm sure will be addressed, but that may be what it is that since this is by address, they're talking about if you previously had a customer at that address, or if you currently have a customer at that specific address, then that point on the map can be counted as having that speed of service. If you're not providing it, never provided to that home, then you can't count that point on the map as having that service. If you're receiving or received universal service or other support from federal, state, or local governments, for example, and have begun to make service available in that area. So if you've got an obligation to provide service because you took funds, then that is an exception. or if you received a waiver to report coverage beyond the maximum distances, so you can also get a waiver. So a lot of this, like I say, it seems to grandfather in people that are already providing services either in an area or maybe at specific addresses. Not sure quite yet how that's going to fall out. The data reporting is done, first off, there's a couple of terms in here that are kind of confusing unless you know what they're talking about. So they talk about fabric a lot. And what they're talking about, they define it as broadband serviceable location. They call it fabric. So later on in the document, they call it fabric, the fabric. And those are locations that are or could be serviced by a broadband connection. So this would be the fabric that the map points lay on top of. So it's all of the homes and businesses that can receive a broadband connection. And on top of that is where this data is going to go. That's going to say, do they get broadband at that service at that speed or not? And then they talk about polygons and shape files. This is all related to the GIS data. So polygons are related to, again, to GIS files. And shape files include things like polygons and lines and points. So when you have mapping data, that's basically what makes up the stuff that appears on your map. You've got your polygons, which could be coverage areas, or it could be what make up buildings, for example, the shapes of buildings. You've got lines that could make up different features of the map, and then you've got your points that would be on that. So that's what they're talking about when they talk about polygons and shape files. And here's just a note that says all terrestrial fixed and satellite service providers must report either polygon shape files or lists of addresses and locations that constitute their service areas. So you would provide the list of addresses that constitute your service area. And again, the open question I have is, can you count those if you have these maximum distances that you're not meeting and you've never provided service there? Sounds like if you've provided service there before, or you're providing service there now with the same technology, then you're okay. So that's an open question for me. And then it talks about fixed wireless. We further require terrestrial fixed wireless providers to report either their shape files in the form of propagation maps and propagation model details that reflect the speeds and latency of their service, or a list of addresses or locations that reflect their service areas. So that's how the data is going to be reported by service providers in these formats. And again, as I mentioned, there's a challenge process here. This is a big part of this, is they want stakeholders to be able to challenge this information. So it's not just that broadband operators can go out and say, yeah, I'm providing this particular speed service in this area. If somebody tries to get that service and they can't get it from you, but you're saying you can, then they can challenge that. Or I don't know if this means that they can't, if they're getting the service and they're doing speed tests. I think if they get the service from you and they're doing speed tests, and again, you say you have gig service and they're claiming you don't, maybe they can challenge based on that. It says state, local, and tribal government entities, consumers, and other entities or individuals may submit data in an online portal to challenge the accuracy of the coverage maps at a particular location. Any information submitted by a provider regarding the availability of broadband internet access service or the fabric. So they can challenge the map itself, like there should be broadband in this area, the fabric, so to speak. They can challenge any of the information that the provider has said. They can challenge the accuracy of that. So you're probably thinking, oh my gosh, everybody and my grandmother can challenge what I say I'm providing. And then you're thinking about all of your customers running speed tests and not taking into account maybe their home Wi-Fi network, or the fact that maybe the speed test is going to some city 3 states away. But there are some, the consumer, there are some things that the consumer has to do. They can't just make a challenge without providing some detailed information about the challenge. So that's the good news. For example, for those who challenge, here are the requirements. They must provide in their submissions contact info, so they got to provide all their contact info, name, address, email address, that kind of thing, and where the broadband coverage is being challenged specifically. They have to provide evidence and details of a request for service. So in other words, if they say they want to get a specific speed service from you and you can't provide it, or an attempted request for service, including the date, the method, and the content of the request, and the details of the response from the provider. So they're going to have to provide the details that you responded to them with, or evidence showing no availability at the disputed location. They can't get it, screenshots, emails. So they've got to document some of this stuff. They can't just go in there and say, I challenge this. A representation of the challenger, that the challenger resides or does business at the location of the dispute or is authorized to request service there. So they can't go looking around on the map if they don't live there or they're not authorized to get service there. And then a certification from an individual or authorized officer or signatory of a challenger that the person examined the information contained in the challenge and that, to the best of the person's actual knowledge, information, or belief, all statements of fact contained in the challenge are true and correct. So they need to certify that they're telling the truth, which is another step in hopefully getting them to not make these frivolous challenges and to really put their ducks in a row before they challenge this. The response from service providers that are challenged, you got to respond within 60 days of receiving an alert in the portal. And by the way, this portal that they talk about is going to be something that's going to be available to the service provider to provide their data, available to consumers to challenge the data, and a lot of communication back and forth between, let's say, the FCC and these entities. So you got to respond within 60 days, and you got to either accept the allegation and submit a correction within 30 days, or you've got to deny the allegation, and then you got to provide proof within the portal to the challenger and to the FCC. Well, I guess in the portal you'd be providing that to the FCC. Once a challenge containing all the required elements is submitted, the location will be identified on the map as in dispute pending resolution. So as soon as a qualified challenge is made, and to be qualified, it has to meet all of those requirements. It has to have all of that documentation. Once it is, then it's going to be considered in dispute or pending on the map. And then the provider and the challenger will have 60 days to attempt to resolve this challenge. And if they can't resolve the challenge, so if the provider says, I'm sorry, we are providing it, and the consumer says, no, you're not, they can't respond to they can't respond or come to an agreement on that, then that'll result in mandatory correction, which means the FCC will tell the provider, well, you need to go in and take that out, or the FCC will do it if the provider doesn't. If no consensus is reached within 60 days after submission of the provider's reply in the portal, then the provider shall report the status in the online portal, after which the FCC will review the evidence and make a determination in favor of the challenger or the provider. So if they can't reach the consensus, then the FCC will look at the evidence on both sides and make a determination. So it's in your best interest to respond to these in a timely fashion, and if you don't respond, then it's going to go against you automatically. If you do respond and you can't come to a consensus, then the FCC is going to act as the judge and I guess the jury in that case. There's just some additional language here for the challenge. This is related to kind of the burden of proof to me. A consumer's challenge must make an initial showing by a preponderance of the evidence that a provider's data are inaccurate, and then the provider by a preponderance of the evidence that its reported data are accurate. Now, if you are being challenged by government, state, local, tribal, or other entities, then the challenger must make a detailed, clear, and methodological sound showing by clear and convincing evidence that a provider's data are inaccurate. So it seems to me that that's a higher burden of proof for these other entities like governments, state, local, tribal governments, probably because, not so much to make it a higher burden of proof for them, but they probably didn't want to make it as high a burden of proof for the consumer. So there it's a preponderance of the evidence for the consumer. So as far as the teeth in this, accountability enforcement, the Broadband Data Act makes it unlawful for an entity or individual to willfully and knowingly or recklessly submit information or data that is materially inaccurate or incomplete with respect to the availability of broadband internet access service or the quality of service with respect to broadband internet access service. So it's interesting that it says an individual. So I don't know if that means that if an individual is challenging something recklessly, willfully, knowingly, if that is something that they would be accountable for or not. I know it certainly applies to the broadband operator. And the FCC specifically said, as far as materially inaccurate or incomplete, they said that's a submission that contains omissions or incomplete or inaccurate information that the Commission finds has a substantial impact on its collection and use of the data collected. So if you are not, if you're not providing complete information and they look at it and see that as being impactful, then that's how they're going to define that. And then recklessly, they say recklessly suggests more than mere negligence, but something less than intent. So you've got willfully and not knowingly, or you've got recklessly, which means it's not necessarily willfully or knowingly, but it's more than mere negligence. So they want to just make sure, if you just goof up, maybe they let that slide. But if they see a pattern, maybe a behavior then you could get in trouble there. And what does that mean? So as far as fees, or they call these forfeitures, so the Commission will find a false statement submitted by a provider as part of its digital opportunity data collection obligations to be an actionable violation, even absent an intent to deceive, if the statement is provided without a reasonable basis for believing that the statement is correct and not misleading. So again, even if you didn't mean to mislead, if you didn't have good reasons for stating that you can provide a specific kind of service in a particular area at a particular speed, for example, if you didn't have a good reason for that, then that would be absent of intent to deceive, but still be something that you could be fined for. And that fine, the FCC will impose a $15,000 fine per violation on providers that file materially inaccurate or incomplete information. This base forfeiture amount will apply in cases where providers file materially inaccurate or incomplete information, and in cases where providers fail to make digital opportunity data collection filings. So this applies to you not providing accurate information, or if you just don't file. So you've got to file this as well. So that's what we got. So thanks everybody for joining me. Let's see, we have Charlotte saying you're not seeing, hey Charlotte, how are you? Not seeing the FCC link of the order you referred to. Can you email it? Yeah, I've got your email, so I will certainly send that to you after the meeting. So it should be, if you're on the, if you don't see it, if you're on the YouTube page where this video is, if you've got it opened up all the way, you can maybe click something down below where you can see where comments are. So basically it's in a comment down in there. So, but I will certainly email it as well. So just look for that. You should be able to find it, and I will send that. So thanks for joining me. I hope this was helpful for you. And if it was, give me please a thumbs up on the YouTube video, not right here because where you're seeing that, because you can't click that. But same thing for the subscribe button. If you would, just on the YouTube video, if you haven't subscribed, click subscribe and click the little bell. When you do, you'll be notified anytime that I'm live, which is once a week, every Tuesday at 3 o'clock, or anytime we go live any other time or post a video, you'll be notified. Usually it's just once a week. So again, that's it for today for Tech Tuesday. I hope this was helpful, and there'll be more information, I'm sure, coming out about this. And if I get more details that are that I think need to be presented, then I'll go ahead and do another broadcast at that time. So thanks for joining me, and I will see you next week for Tech Tuesday. Bye-bye.